can remember getting a letter from Westpac saying that my interest rate had gone to 21.5%.
21.5%.
Yeah, that was when I was running the building company I think it was the early 80s.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah. Mind you, I think, wages proportionally were higher then, so it's not quite as draconian as it sounds, but it was a pretty tough time back then.
Welcome to Building Perspective, the Master Builders SA podcast. I'm your host, Will Frogley. Join me as I speak with some characters in the building and construction industry.
At Dulux Trade, we're making paint easy for tradies all over Australia. With over 230 stores and over 1,000 paint professionals, expert advice for your next job is closer than you might realise. Need specialist advice for a tricky job? Easy. On site and need it delivered? Easy. So get to know your local Dulux Trade Centre, Inspirations Paint or Paint Spot today. And while you're there, sign up for Dulux Trade Direct for trade pricing and simplified ordering. Because at Dulux Trade, we're making paint easy.
There's a lot going on in the industry at the moment. Everyone's well aware of it, and we thought who better to come in and discuss some of the themes at the moment than Tom Grace, who's a partner at Fenwick, Elliot Grace, the construction law specialist. Tom, great to have you on Building Perspective.
No worries. Good to be here, Will.
And you're a somewhat of an oddity in the industry, aren't you? In that you're originally an engineer who then, I guess, went over to the dark side and became a lawyer. There's not too many people who have been an engineer and a lawyer, are there, in South Australia?
Oddity's kinder than a lot of people describe me, Will. But yeah, no, that is right. I started out as an engineer and worked for a short period of time for what used to be called Telecom Australia, and then went and joined my family's construction business. And after 4 years, we had a bit of a falling out in the family, and I went out and set up in opposition to the family. And for about 20 years from then on, ran my own construction business and built hundreds of residential and some commercial, some industrial projects.
What was the name of that business?
It was called Colony Homes.
Colony Homes.
It's actually still running today because I did sell it in the end, and it's still running quite successfully in the Adelaide Hills.
Fantastic. So, Tom, it's what I think the listeners would be really interested to hear from today is some of the main things you're seeing out there in the industry, and perhaps what could be coming up as responses to what's going on out there in the industry. What are some of the things you're seeing at the moment? One
of the big issues that we're seeing, I think it comes out of the COVID boom, if I call it that, because a lot of money got injected into the building industry to cover the slowdown that was expected. And as a result of that, the building industry jumped pretty hard. And then we had price rises in materials and in labour, and shortage of materials and shortage of labour. And as a result, I think what's happened is builders have started to front load in the residential sector. I'm seeing this quite a bit. Builders have been front loading their progress claims. So they'll put down a percentage. Say, for example, in the MBA contract, the builder has the power when they're signing up the owner to specify the percentages due at each particular stage. So you might have 20% on pouring of the foundation, for example, and then 20% on wall frame and 20% on brickwork, etc. Now, generally speaking, back when I was building, and I think it's pretty much the same still, once you get to second fix, you've probably got around 35 to 40% of your spend still to go to finish the house. But I've seen contracts recently where builders have taken it out to 90% of the money is due by the completion of gyprock. So before even second fix is finished. So they've only got 10% to deal with probably the last 30 to 40% of money to be spent. And the result, of course, of that is that the builder gets a lot of positive cash flow up front, but then you're seeing some houses are taking a long time to be finished because the builder looks at that house where they've received more than they perhaps should have, and they think, well, to finish off that house, I'm going to have a negative cash flow, and they go and start another one. So we're seeing some long builds. The worst ones I've seen are houses that have taken up to 3 years to complete and still not completed. And, I have builders coming to me concerned about what to do about that because they feel that they can't finish the house for the price they've agreed to finish it for. And what can they do about that? And then I have owners coming to see me with a similar problem. Their house is not being finished and the progress payments that are due to be paid to the builder from this point forward wouldn't finish the house if they went and got another builder to finish it.
That's very risky, isn't it, Tom? Allowing the time of a build to really blow out that much?
It certainly is, and unfortunately, it's almost like a death by 1,000 cuts for both parties, because it happens gradually over a period of months, and then suddenly it's too late, and you've got the builder perhaps committed on several projects, or sometimes many projects, with negative cash flow to finish them all, and looking at what they're going to do to try to get out of that. So it's a very difficult period for the industry in some sectors, in the residential sector at the moment, I think. And what we're seeing is, people genuinely wanting to resolve this and move on. But how do you do that? And quite often what happens is there's some sort of a negotiation between the owner and the builder, where they'll say, look, the owner might realise that the builder just can't actually afford to finish the home, especially if it's a small builder only doing 1 or 2 homes, and they'll actually decide to tip in a bit of extra money. So I'm seeing that happen quite a bit. But of course, then quite often the owner's stretched for finance too. They've borrowed as much as they can to have the house built. So the bank's not too keen to extend more money. Against the background of that, of course, we have seen an increase in property values. So sometimes the bank will come back and revalue it and extend their loan a bit further. But then you're getting interest rate increases as well. So that tension is not quite so easily to be resolved.
It's been an incredible period of price escalation in the building construction industry, and it has settled down a bit for some products, like materials like timber and steel, for example. But for other things, insulation, glass, those price increases are still they're still very real, and it's making it very hard for the builders still to price jobs, isn't it?
Oh, it's extraordinary compared to what's happened in the last perhaps 20 to 30 years. As you probably can tell by looking at me, I've been around a bit longer than that. And I can remember back in the 80s when we had inflation of 14%, and you would never sign up a fixed price lump sum contract in those days. It was always with a rise and fall clause. Every single house had a rise and fall clause. And of course, then we had a period of relative stability in prices, and it was okay for many years to build with a fixed price lump sum contract. And I think everyone thought that was going to be the rest of the future for us. But as you say, I mean, we've had price increases of, I think, in the order of 30 to 40% in some, steel and timber. And now, as you're saying, in other, glass and insulation, there's still significant increases. So the industry needs to work out how to deal with that, because you can't have a model where that pain is only being taken by builders. It needs to be sorted out in some way, that there's a contractual mechanism that is agreed upon where the pain is shared. Unfortunately, financial institutions, banks, don't like rise and fall clauses.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that one, Tom. So how was it that they agreed to lend with rise and fall clauses back when those interest rates were so high, say 30 or so years ago?
Yeah, so well, I think everyone just acknowledged that was how it had to be, because if you had inflation at 14%, if you think about that, if a house is going to take, let's say, optimistically 7 or 8 months to build, the price is going to be going up 8 or 10% during that period of time. Now, it won't affect the whole house, but if a builder's only making, at the end of the build, after paying all of their preliminaries and costs and so on, they might be only putting away 10%. So they're going to be doing for nothing. So, conceivably, people just have said, well, we'll have to put up with it. We have to work out a way. And so in those days, there was an index published every month. And the day you signed your contract, you knew what that index was. And say if the index number was, say, 120, when you put your first progress payment in a month later, you looked up to see what the index was. And if the index was 121 by then, you just multiplied your progress payment by 121 divided by 120. And that was how it worked.
And that's similar how the governments, state governments, working rise and fall into some of their contracts at the moment. They tie it to the ABS Producer Price Index, South Australia Building Construction Index. So that's what they're using for that. But yeah, banks just don't seem to want to borrow it for residential jobs, do they?
No. And I think historically it was taken advantage of. And that's probably what happened. And that's why banks are cautious about it now. But the ABS...
On that, you mean what was suppliers were raising their prices so much because they knew that people would pay it because a rise and fall clause was in place?
Well, no, potentially what could have been happening was that builders would lock their subcontractors and their suppliers into a fixed price on the job and then still charge the owner the rise and fall index amount. So builders were able to make more of a profit out of the home than they otherwise should have. And so I think banks realised that was going on and decided, we'll stop that happening, we'll make you have a fixed price. And that's fine. That coincided with a reduced amount of inflation at about that point in time, so no one's been able to justifiably complain until now.
Yeah, that's right. It's been pretty steady for years and years and years up until about the last year, hasn't it? The inflation. So it did seem ridiculous to anyone in construction when there was talk from the RBA that the cash rate was going to stay at a record low for 3 years or so. Everyone in our industry was just looking at these price increases, double digits for pretty much every input you can think of. And we're a massive industry and it just didn't seem at all realistic. But how could the RBA get it so wrong? Anyway, we're straying a long way, I know, from your area of expertise, Tom, but it still baffles me to this day.
Well, yeah, look, it is outside of my pay grade, but at the same time, Will, I can remember getting a letter from Westpac saying that my interest rate had gone to 21.5%.
21.5%.
Yeah, that was when I was running the building company I think it was the early 80s.
Yeah, that's scary.
Yeah. Mind you, I think, wages proportionally were higher then, so it's not quite as draconian as it sounds, but it was a pretty tough time back then. But I agree with you. There was no way interest rates could stay at the level they were for so long.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Turning to another issue now, the issue of building inspectors. Now, people are looking at them more and more these days because you still don't have to be licensed to be a building inspector, right, in South Australia?
No, there's no licensing regime for building inspectors. They can basically put a shingle out the front and put whatever fancy name they like on their inspection service and charge a fee for it and then turn up to inspect, particularly in the residential market. So there's two aspects to it. It's pre-purchase inspections for people that are buying a house that's been in existence for some time, but it's also inspections of houses that are under construction to see whether a progress payment should be made because, perhaps the owner's concerned about some complaint about some minor defect or something that's not quite finished. And so if you've got a person who's unlicensed carrying out that inspection, judging the work of a licensed builder and licensed subcontractors, it doesn't seem a level playing field to me. And I think something needs to happen there because what is happening, what we're seeing happening is you might get an owner who's very concerned because people get very emotionally attached to their home that they're having built and they can spot a minor imperfection of some sort. And so they'll get an inspector to come out and they'll point out this imperfection. And if the person's not licensed and doesn't have sort of street cred as far as what's a reasonable trade standard, what sort of workmanship is normal in the industry, they're likely to excite the owner into thinking that they've got a serious problem. And then money stops flowing and then you end up with a dispute. And I can understand why builders are concerned about that. I think it's a really sensible thing for licensing to occur. On the other hand, you might have builders who the work is a bit less than should be. The standard is lower than it should be. And justifiably, you would have a building inspector come in and say, this needs to be fixed. But hopefully that's a licensed inspector that's got some industry knowledge.
For me, it really comes down to, maintaining confidence to build from the public. I think that's so important. And you can certainly see it from the industry's perspective in that, particularly in the last couple of years when there's been such a shortage of quality people, there's been a lot of opportunistic people come in working unlicensed or beyond the scope of their license and effectively undercutting, in a lot of cases, the work of the reputable providers. Now, in that kind of environment, someone gets pinged now and then, but there are things in place for the people who do the right thing, and they can probably look at building inspectors and think, like you said, it's not a level playing field.
No, correct. And I can remember back in the early 80s, I reckon it was, maybe late 70s, there was a real shortage of bricklayers at a particular time. I'm thinking of, and we were building.
Some things always stay the same, don't they? Here we are in 2023 with exactly that problem.
Yeah. And I remember we advertised day after day after day, trying to, in those days, you used to advertise in the advertiser, for subcontractors. And eventually we got a chap that came out and took up at Mount Barker we were building, and the work was appalling. And after 3 or 4 days, we said, right, that's it, you're out, and kicked him off the site. And there was a gang of 4 of them. And I met one of the others at a Bianco a few months later, and he said, you were right to kick him off. That was his first ever bricklaying job. He was a butcher.
Oh, that's scary, isn't it?
so these things, you know.
So he'd had no training at all. He just rocked up on site one day and started laying bricks.
Yeah, and he advertised for bricklayers to work for him. That was his idea. He didn't even have a string line on the site until
it's frightening. Yeah.
So, you know, these things have happened before, that we've had, you know, terrible shortages of skilled trades, and they'll happen again. But this is why you need a licensing regime in for inspectors, so that, you know, people can come in and say that is not adequate, and it needs, and you know, particularly if the builder's not confident to be able to kick a subcontractor off the site, doesn't have the sufficient expertise to know that the work of the subcontractor is not up to scratch, and you've got a third party that can come in and back the builder up, perhaps.
And I think the reputable, you know, inspectors out there would actually, and the high quality ones would actually, you know, welcome, because it'd be a point of difference to the, I guess, the mediocre inspectors that are out there.
Absolutely, and they do. I know, because I'm a member myself of the Association of Building Consultants, and a life member actually now. And I know that the senior members of that organisation back this to the hilt, and that association will back it to the hilt. They want licensing because they want to have that sort of credibility behind their businesses, and they don't want people setting up business that don't have the expertise and basically spoiling the reputation of the industry.
That's right. The reputation of the industry and confidence to build, or whatever it is, that's so important. So with that in mind, do you think that is something that the state government will look at legislating, this German government?
I understand there is interest in doing so, but what is needed is for people to put their hand up and complain about instances where these things have gone wrong. And I, you know, in my line of work now, in dispute resolution in the construction industry, which is where I basically work all the time now, I've seen it from both sides. I've seen a building inspection report that was so lacking in detail that missed very significant defects in a pre-purchase inspection that resulted in somebody buying a house without knowing of the sort of workmanship that had been. It was an owner-builder job, owner-builder renovation, and, you know, the underfloor plumbing underneath the house, for example, was tied up with duct tape, you know, and the sewerage that I'm talking about was tied together with duct tape.
Oh.
So, and you know, there wasn't really adequate attention drawn to that in the building inspection report. And on the other hand, you know, I see building inspectors that come out and have a look at a house that really you'd say there's not much wrong with a new house. You know, there's some very minor imperfections, and they'll just make a report that's very, very difficult. And I know the government's interested in doing something about this, but we need people to stand up and give complaints, feed them up to the MBA or any of the other associations in the industry, so that representations can be made and the government will realise there is sufficient willpower for this to be done.
Because it's very common for most people, you know, building their own home or buying their own home is the biggest investment they're ever going to make in their life. And you do hear that as pretty common advice, you know, get an inspection report before you buy. But if it's not a credible report, that completely defeats the purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the worst ones that I saw was a young family, 3 young kids, bought a house out at Golden Grove a year or 2 ago, and they had a pest inspection and a pre-purchase inspection, gave it a clean bill of health. And about 3 months after they moved in, the lady asked, the woman who owned the place with her husband, asked for an antenna to be put in the roof. And the chap went up to put a cable through to the antenna, and he came down and he said, "Did you get an inspection done?" And it was riddled with white ants.
Yeah.
And it was a long-term problem. It was there well before it was inspected. And that cost, in the end, I mean, we managed to, acting for her, managed to persuade the insurer to back up. And it was well over $300,000 worth to repair that house. And, you know, that young couple finished up, they had props in the bedrooms of the kids, all because an inadequate inspection was done in the first place. So if people are going to say, I'm a pest inspector, I'm the sort of person who can detect white ants, they need to have some training and be able to, some accreditation to be able to actually say, to make that claim. Otherwise, you can have a butcher going out and doing it at the moment.
Scary stuff. So what else are you kind of seeing out there as common issues or themes at the moment, Tom, or perhaps something else that you think is likely to be coming up from a legislative perspective?
So one other one is in the commercial sector. So in the commercial construction sector, as you would know, is what's called the Building and Construction Industry Security of Payment Act, which is a long phrase, but basically there's legislation brought in the last few years to try to speed up the flow of cash in the construction industry. And we all can remember back to the spectacular failures of a couple of the large construction companies in South Australia where, subcontractors have lost their homes as a result of that because money's been held until that company went into liquidation. The classic case of one of them that you and I know about, I think it was something like $25 or $30 million in negative when the company went in. And I had people coming in to see me after that, young couples that had lost $500,000 in that liquidation and couldn't get anything. So as a result, the government brought in this security of payment legislation, which is intended to speed up cash flow to make sure that large contractors pay down to subcontractors in a very short period of time after the money is due. Now, what we're seeing recently is what we call deeming provisions being put into contracts, where the contractor will say, when you make your payment claim, doesn't matter what day in the month it arrives, under our contract, we're going to say it arrived, let's say, on the 21st of the month. So if it arrives on the 10th, we didn't get it until the 21st. If it arrives on the 23rd, we didn't get it until the 21st of the next month. That basically means that the contractor, the large contractor, is probably getting roughly a month's extra cash flow every month. The cash flow is delayed by 1 month. And if you're a contractor turning over, I don't know, $100 million a year or something, you're getting, $10 million of extra cash flow by that. So it'd be good if it worked. And at the moment, it's being said that it does work. Now, in New South Wales and Queensland, the courts have said you can't do that. And under the Security of Payment Act, once a payment claim arrives, that's the day we start the counting. And under that act, after a claim arrives, you've got 15 business days to agree with the amount that's claimed or dispute it. And if you don't dispute it, then you have to pay it in full. So it's going to make a big difference if we can stamp out that process in South Australia. And we've currently, I'm involved in one that's going to the Supreme Court in the next, I don't know when it'll be listed, but it'll be listed in the next few months. So we'll find out what the court's got to say about those types of clauses. And we're hopeful that the court will agree with New South Wales and Queensland and say that when a payment claim arrives, that's when the money starts or the days start to be counted. And it should speed up cash flow in the industry. But I've seen 2 or 3 insolvencies as a result of this delay of cash flow, because a small subcontractor that's, running a business with a family, if they're getting to have to wait 2 months, 3 months for their money, especially if they've pushed their business out, expanded a bit, that's a lot of money to wait.
On a related topic, trust accounts are seen as the answer by some to the issue of payment. Western Australia, I understand, has brought something in not that long ago. Do you know how that's working in WA?
Look, it's coming in progressively. So I think from the 1st of January next year is when it really comes down in value. At the moment, it's larger contracts. But the way in which it's working, I can't give you any anecdotal evidence as to how it's being handled over there. But I can't imagine that it would be anything other than an administrative burden for builders, because every single progress claim that comes in, you have to send a certain percentage of that claim to be deposited in a trust account. And it has to sit there until the final retention money under the contract is being paid back to the subcontractor. Now, as far as subcontractors are concerned, there's a certain benefit to that, of course, because what happened in those large liquidations, particularly the one that I referred to with the 20 or 30 million a few years ago, as you probably know, Will, often in the commercial sector, when a subcontractor puts in a claim for payment, about 5% of that money gets held by the builder to make sure that the subcontractor does finish the job properly. And then when the job's finished, you might get 2.5% of that back, but still 2.5% is kept to make sure they finish rectify any defects. And that money can be held for 12 months, 2 years sometimes. And of course, if a builder's got a lot of subcontractor work going on, if they're turning over, $50 or $100 million a year, 2.5% mounts up to a lot of money. And then if the builder goes into liquidation, all of that retention money gets lost because it goes to the liquidator. And we all know that it's very unlikely that there's going to be a return to the subcontractors from the liquidation. So as a result, WA has brought in this legislation, which in some ways to me seems a bit like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but at least it'll crack the nut.
We've been very fortunate in South Australia to date that we haven't seen the insolvencies that other states and territories have. But it's pretty scary out there. It feels like every week someone around the country is going under. It's quite nerve-wracking for anyone in the industry, even if it's not local, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. And I feel a bit like we're in a very difficult period in the next few months because of those issues that we talked about earlier, for example, front-loaded progress claims. And then secondly, if you talk about, deeming provisions in commercial contracts, I think there could be quite a bit of cash flow that's tied up. And of course, has that cash flow been kept in reserve, or has it been used to pay for things that, now can't be sold to bring back money into the business? When I was building, I remember people used to say to me, as soon as you see them rolling up in a Mercedes, it's time to, make sure you're getting paid. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, have spent a lot of the money that was the bonus money, if you like, that came from COVID and those stimulus packages that came out and the extra money that went into the industry. And now we're probably back to more of a reality time. And there will be tough times ahead, Will, but hey, I've seen it before. I went through the periods in the 80s when there was very slow workflow. And I remember at one stage, I think we tendered on something like 200 projects without winning one.
Wow.
That would not happen today, of course, because there's plenty of work around now. But there have been times before when it's been tight, and there will be times again. But that's what the industry we're in, Will. It's a boom and a bust industry.
That's right. Well, Tom, it's always very interesting to have a chat with you about what's going on in the industry, and today was no exception. So thanks very much for your time and being part of the Building Perspective podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for joining me on Building Perspective. For more information on master builders or our guests, please visit our website at mbasa.com.au.